With all of the focus and with all of the fixation that is centered around the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and with all of the speculation about the rebuilding of a temple there, and the reoccurring news about red heifers that are getting ready to be sacrificed, what if I told you that there is already a temple that God is building? Just maybe not how or where you might think. Let me explain. In John 4, Jesus has a famous conversation with the woman at the well. And he tells this woman that there's coming a time when people will neither worship on this mountain or on that mountain, but the Father is seeking those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. Now, this is a commonly quoted passage, but what exactly did Jesus mean? Well, we have to understand that the woman that Jesus was speaking to was a Samaritan. And the Samaritans also had a temple in the same way that the Jews did, except their temple was on a different mountain, on Mount Gerizim, and the Jews obviously had their temple in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. So what Jesus was clearly saying is that something was about to change. Worshiping God was not to be about a geographical location or a physical structure, but rather that we would worship God, connect with God, commune with God in spirit and in truth. And this understanding would have been very different from the woman. As a Samaritan, it would have been very different from the Jewish mindset that really focused and centered around a physical temple structure. Now, this isn't the only time that Jesus spoke about the temple in a way that his contemporaries didn't quite understand. In Matthew 23 and 24, Jesus prophesied and predicted that the temple in Jerusalem, the structure around which all of the old covenant really centered around, Jesus said that within a generation, that temple would be destroyed. And right on cue, within a generation, 40 years later, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. Jesus said, your house is going to be left desolate, and that house has been desolate ever since. The temple was destroyed, and there's never been another physical temple. But this is what all of the speculation today is centering around, is the rebuilding of another temple, a third temple. But the question that we have to ask as Christians is that what God desires? Does God desire to go back to a temple and to go back to temple worship? Because when we read the New Testament, it doesn't seem like Jesus nor his apostles spoke like that. In fact, Stephen, who was the first martyr in Acts 7, he's standing in front of the Jewish council and he's preaching about Jesus being the Messiah, and he tells them that God does not dwell in a building made by human hands. And he was specifically speaking about the temple that was in Jerusalem. So they took it as him speaking against Moses, speaking against the law, speaking against their house of worship, and that was a major reason why they stoned him and killed him. And it's worth noting that Saul, who we know as the Apostle Paul, was standing there, a zealous Jew, and he approved of the killing of Stephen. But 10 chapters later in the book of Acts, Paul himself is standing in Athens at the Areopagus, and he preaches the same message that got Stephen killed in front of the Jews. He said, God does not dwell in buildings, dwell in temples made with human hands. Now, they were not downplaying the importance and the significance of what the temple signified and stood for. The temple was necessary for a time because it taught us about the holiness of God. You can't come into God's presence nonchalantly. You have to be purified, you have to be washed, you have to be cleansed in order to worship a holy God. But it seems that all along, God's goal was not to always dwell in a physical temple, but his purpose and his plan was to make his people his temple, to make his people his dwelling place. Now, this shouldn't sound like a crazy idea to Christians, because this is what the new covenant was always about God making his dwelling with his people, about God making his dwelling in his people. This is what Isaiah prophesied. This is what Jeremiah prophesied. This is what Ezekiel prophesied. All of the Old Testament prophets speaking about the new covenant were always speaking about God making his dwelling, making his home, making his habitation within and among his people. And so the temple served a purpose, and the temple was a picture of the bride of Christ. The temple was a picture of Christ and his church, in the same way that all of the sacrifices were a type and a shadow of Christ. The Passover lamb was a picture of Christ. The red heifer was a picture of Christ. And so while I'm on that, let me talk about it for a second. The red heifer pointed to Christ. The significance of the red heifer heifer sacrifice we read about in Numbers 19, where we are told about the specifications of the sacrifice and what the purpose of it really was. And it was to purify the people of God, to enter into the presence of God. They were to take a red heifer without blemish, without defect, one that had never been yoked. It was set apart for this purpose. They were to take that red heifer outside of the camp to sacrifice it, to burn it as an act of purification. Well, this is specifically referenced in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, that deals with so much of the significance of the sacrifices in the temple and the high priest, and how all of it pointed to Christ. In verses 11 and 12 of chapter 13, it says that the bodies of those animals whose blood was brought in to the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sins, they were burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. So the author reminds us of the red heifer sacrifice and then points directly to Christ. He was taken outside of the camp. He was killed as a sacrifice for the purification of sins. He's the ultimate sacrifice that purifies us to enter into the presence of God. That was fulfilled in him. Why would our focus be on a cow when it should be on Christ? Why would our focus be on rebuilding a physical temple in Jerusalem when Jesus said that he came to build his church, of which the New Testament writers speak of as though it is the temple of God? And just in case you don't believe what I'm saying or don't maybe understand quite what I'm getting at, let me show it to you. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, Paul asked the question, "Do you not know that you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple." So he's speaking to Christians, he's speaking to the church and saying, you are the temple of God. You are the dwelling place of God. It's not that Paul didn't understand the significance of the temple. He surely did. Paul understands the significance of the temple as the dwelling place of God, and he's saying now in the new covenant, it's you. You're the temple. And what has changed? Well, the new covenant has come. Christ has come. The Spirit of God has been poured out and given, and he makes his home, he makes his habitation in us. And that could have never happened if Jesus did not first come and do away with sin by offering himself as a sacrifice so that we could become his dwelling place. So what I'm saying is that we are the spiritual reality of what the physical temple signified. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 6, verse 16, and says, we are the temple of the living God. Speaking to the church, speaking to Christians, speaking to believers, we are the temple of the living God. Again, Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 2 and says that we are being built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus being the chief cornerstone. Now, everybody would have understood the language that he was speaking about. He's the cornerstone, the apostles and the prophets are the foundation, and then us, we are being built on top of them as a dwelling place for God by the Spirit, as the temple of God. So Christians, believers in Jesus Christ, we are being built together, Jew and Gentile, into one structure that the Messiah himself is building. And it's not just Paul who speaks this way. We already saw it with Stephen, but Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2 uses the same language. He uses the same imagery of us being living stones, being built upon Christ as a new temple unto God. And if we read into Revelation about the future, about the new creation, we are specifically told in chapter 21, there is no temple there because God is there. The Lamb is there, and he is the temple. We are the temple. God has made his dwelling with us, and our dwelling is with him. There's no need for the physical structure when we are the reality of what that represented. And so Christians that are hyper fixated on going back to that, I believe, are taking steps backwards. We're wanting to hit reverse and go back to the types, go back to the shadows when the reality was fully given in Christ. And so despite all of the speculation, I'm not convinced that they're even close to doing it, but let's say there was to be a temple rebuilt, would God be pleased with it? Is that what God desires, for us to go back to temple sacrifices and temple worship when he has made us his temple? The book of Hebrews makes it very plain that the law and the sacrifices, those were types and shadows of what was to come. But Christ is the true substance. Christ is the true reality. He is what all of those things pointed to. He is the once and for all sacrifice for sin. In fact, we're told there's no other sacrifice that has to be made. He is the Passover lamb. He is the red heifer by which we are purified. And his body, the church, is the temple of the living God. So I believe that our focus as Christians should be on that temple, the one that Christ is building.